What's up, friends? Thank you for tuning in. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 of my favorite books that I think every serious artist and designer needs to have in their library. Now, when I was a kid, I used to think that both books and vegetables were disgusting. As I've grown, I've learned that vegetables not only are good for my health, but they can also be really delicious. So stick with me to the end as we find some real tasty treats, creative treats buried in these 3 books. Let's get into it. Okay, so the first book of the 3 is How to Draw, right, by Scott Robertson with Thomas Bertling. And this is a fantastic place to start your drawing journey. So it starts off with a list of exercises, right? Ways to get your hand control to a level where you can really start to represent some of the things that may be in your mind. And from this point, it just progresses into more and more complex parts of the drawing process, right? So perspective drawing and different techniques. It goes through camera lenses and different terminologies that are related to drawing in perspective. So really, this is a fantastic foundational book with some really beautiful illustrations and sketches to help put, no pun intended, put all the lessons into perspective. It talks about using 3D underlays, how to set ellipses into perspective, and all of these really valuable lessons. And then once you are able to, and it comes with a list of exercises as well, so as you're going through, practice each of the exercises. It then gets into drawing volumes, right? So this gets a bit more involved, and we move from just planar surfaces and perspective to more complex surfacing. And again, kind of a step-by-step walkthrough on how you can go about creating convincing 3-dimensional objects. And it gets super technical about laying center lines and projecting lines across your center line to get everything aligned in perspective. But a ton of really valuable techniques are baked into this book. And then once you get these kind of organic forms on paper, you will then get into drawing environments. So this is the compilation of all your perspective drawing and your organic forms drawing leading up to putting it all together and drawing full environments. And again, a ton of beautiful illustrations and really pointed information about process and the thinking behind building these kinds of sketches. He then gets into drawing aircraft, another fantastic use of organic form and perspective combined into something that is vehicular or product based. So this book just builds upon lessons upon lessons upon lessons that eventually lead you to a place where you're drawing things that are real. Talks about the use of visual research, really fantastic tutorials in this book. And then once you get through this airplane section, it moves into, okay, drawing vehicles, right? So about finding reference, talks a little bit about the packaging that you should be aware of when drawing vehicles, different perspectives and lens angles that you can use to create more drama in your sketches. All right. And this is really one of the best foundational drawing books that I'm yet to find. And then in the end of this book, he wraps it up nicely with different sketching styles and mediums that you can use to represent the images in your mind on paper, all the way from ballpoint pen to Copic marker and Pilot high-tech pens to Pentel pocket brush pens and even gouache and different types of paint or mixed media. Great place to start for any aspiring product designer, industrial designer, or just artist that wants to draw in a representational way. Okay, so book number 2 is How to Render, the The Fundamentals of Light, Shadow, and Reflectivity. And this is another one from Scott Robertson and with Thomas Bertling. We start off with, just some of your rendering tools and of the tools of the trade, if you will, if you're not using Photoshop. So these are some of the manual tools that are available to you. And he starts off, and again, this builds on the lessons from how to draw, right? So if you haven't read how to draw and start with this book, you might be lost a little bit with certain terminology or skill set. So I recommend starting with how to draw and then getting into how to render. So it starts with, different types of light, right? And this idea that value change equals a form change. Different types of light, and then that moves into shading, or casting shadows, and the science of casting shadows. It's a little bit mathematical, if you will. There's no equations or anything, but very technical, I'll say. And then he moves into rendering geometric forms. So cones, circles, squares, the cube, that type of thing. And he talks a little bit about different mediums that you can use to render these different geometric shapes. And again, really beautifully illustrated images that are great examples of the lessons that he's going throughout the book. And then once you're finished kind of learning how to render geometric forms, gets into rendering complex volumes, so more organic forms, compound shapes, this type of thing. Right, so again, building off of the lessons on the previous section, but then taking it to the next level. And he talks a little bit about how you might do this in Photoshop as well. And there's just tons of value, no pun intended, right? We're talking about contours and value shading, but tons of value in this book. And then he moves again into rendering specific objects, right? Cars, for example, interiors, mech creatures, characters, and there's even some, what do you call a guest spot by Neville Page and how to draw organic form. And in this case, he's drawing some concept dinosaur, right? So really rich information. And then he's talking about different techniques for sketching environments. And there's a guest spot by Rob Ruppel, really incredible artist. I'd recommend. This is another book of his that might be useful. What's it called? It is called Graphic LA. Well, here it is. Right, so throughout this book, there are other references as well. So I recommend this book as a starting point, but once you get into this book, there are other references in the book that will allow you to continue your journey and continue building your library. Towards the end of the book, we start to get a bit more technical with reflections and the science of reflections and the physics of reflections. So he really goes through and breaks it down so that to help you actually understand what you're looking at, what you're seeing, and in turn allowing you to recreate the images in your mind in a really compelling way. Talks about reflections in indoor scenes and reflections in outdoor scenes and how to treat them differently, and different things that you need to consider when executing these different types of environments that are surrounding a shiny or reflective object. And then he does start getting into different types of surface treatments and material usage and how to accurately represent different materials when you're rendering, which leads us really nicely into our next book. But before we get there, we finish out this book with some rendering examples. So these two books by Scott Robertson with Thomas Bertling are incredible places to start. And if you're really interested in more of the artistic and the more painterly side of the creative process, this last book is phenomenal. So Color and Light, A Guide for the Realist Painter by James Gurney is our third book, our third recommendation. And this book really gets into the more artistic side of light and the more scientific even side of light in representational images. And he talks about tradition and some of the history of painting and different artists from previous generations and how they've used light successfully. Right, he then gets into sources of light. Right, so this is really for the artist that wants to understand what they're seeing and to represent and recreate these images in a really painterly and accurate way. So he talks about, there's tons of graphs, which I always find interesting, about different types of light and the spectrum, and these start to inform how we pick colors, how we use colors when we're creating an illustration for pitch, for example, or just trying to create a future environment or a concept environment with different types of compelling lighting, right? So luminescence and what that's all about and how to recreate that. If you haven't seen or read the books Dinotopia, James Gurney is the creator of Dinotopia, which was one of my favorite childhood books. I had no idea at the time that I would be reading James Gurney's book on painting, 10 years, 15 years later. But some of this covers similar topics to what's covered in Scott Robertson's book, but he really goes in depth on color theory, color usage, creating reflected light, and how to create color palettes, right, to really become sophisticated in the way that we choose colors and apply them. So this book is really for the artist side of our designer selves, if you will. So different color schemes that you can choose to create a holistic painting or holistic images. And then he gets into visual perception. Right? So it talks about tone, right? Tone and value, and how that's an important part that underlies all of our color images or colored images, is also being sensitive to the values that we're using. Right, so this is really a more technical book for representational art, but it's a fantastic supplement to any of these other books around technical drawing. This is more of the technical painting side of it, and they really dovetail nicely with the first two books that we've already discussed. Right? And this will allow us to really create realistic images. And even if you don't want to read everything, which obviously I highly recommend that you do and you should, and you will feel inclined to when you start to really get into creating imagery. But even if you don't, the imagery here is just really quite beautiful, and it's a beautiful, fabulous book just to have on your shelf for when you do feel inclined to read the whole thing. And again, at the end of this book, there are a series of recommended readings, right? You have 2 full pages of reading to continue diving in and gaining a deeper understanding of both art and how to create paintings. And this will all help to inform your industrial design, your concept art, this type of thing. So these 3 books, Color and Light, How to Render, and How to Draw, are a fantastic place for any artist and designer to start, and really a must-have in the library. Take care.
Did he tell me why?